Hi, everyone. Thank you again for coming. I want to thank the sponsors of the event, the Stanford Review, the Stanford Conservative Society, and of course, the Hoover Institution. Today, we'll be having Abe Sofaer speak with us today. He's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute. He's an Air Force veteran, and in 1979, he was appointed a judge of the Southern District of New York. In 1985, Secretary Shultz appointed him as a legal advisor in the State Department, where he received the Distinguished Service Award in 1989, and that's the highest State Department award for a non-civil servant. So it's pretty special to have him here with us, and he was the first George Shultz Distinguished Scholar and Senior Fellow at Hoover in 1994. And he'll be speaking with us a little bit today about his book. So please give me a warm welcome to Abe Sofaer. Thanks again.
See you. Hi, it's really good to see you all here. This is a real step up in our relations with the conservative organization here in the student body at Stanford. I've spoken to this group over the years, over the last 16 years. And I must say, we must remember Arnold Beichmann, who was the guy who got that started, the relationship between Hoover and the conservative group. He passed away at the age of about 97, still writing op-eds. I think I get the sense that if you write op-eds every week, you stay alive a long time. Anyway, he was a great guy, fun, wonderful, wonderful man. And he reached out to the students early on, and this continues. So I'm delighted to be part of it. So we'll talk, I will talk, give you an idea of what the book is about, how it came about, and then we'll open it up, because I think there's a lot to talk about. Today, of course, targeted killing, Iran, lots of stuff. And that's what the book is aimed at, providing a conceptual framework to deal with uses of force that are conventionally, under standard international law principles, regarded as illegal. So you say, why do you have to write a book about illegal actions? And the reason is there are very serious threats facing the world. Of course, we learned that from 9/11, although 9/11 was not a situation where we would have been acting illegally if we had acted before 9/11. We had been attacked 5 times. It was quite clear to me, and I would say to most international lawyers, that we could have taken some form of preventive action even before 9/11 under established international law. But it did lead to the issuance of the National Security Strategy of 2002, which for the first time made explicit the notion that we would use force preventively, not just preemptively, not just when there was an imminent threat of harm, but preventively before that, in order to prevent a use of force, particularly by a terrorist group armed with a weapon of mass destruction. But obviously, the concept applies in many contexts. And what are these dangers that face us today? The danger of unconventional attack. Now, the concept of preemption, as you know, is associated with armies. You collect an army on one side of a border, you can see them. And it still happens. In '67, Israel was confronted with armies of Arab states collecting across the border, and realized that if they didn't do something soon, which of course they didn't do in '73, and they were attacked, but in '67 they did not wait. They acted first, and that war was much less damaging to Israel. So you can make mistakes not attacking as you can make mistakes attacking. Now, there's also failed states and rogue regimes. That's another factor that we have here that makes the world more dangerous. The international system is based on the idea that states have sovereign responsibilities, and the reason you don't have to attack when you're not attacked or about to be attacked under international law is because international law assumes that those other states out there are going to do their jobs. They're going to keep terrorist groups from thriving within their borders, training terrorists, and attacking people outside their borders. But many states are either failed states and have no government capable of doing that, or are what we call rogue regimes. You could call them whatever you wish. The fact of the matter is there are many states out there that do not fulfill their obligation to prevent terrorist groups from getting the kind of help that they got in Afghanistan, for example, or that they are getting now in some countries, and attacking across borders. There's also the fact that the potential destructiveness of weapons has increased. It is easier for a non-state actor to obtain and use weapons that are more destructive than it had been in the past. And the capacity to do so is increased. The cyber system, the ease of travel, the fact that you don't need very much money to launch a major attack such as the 9/11 attack, cost approximately $250,000 to inflict over $1 billion of damage. And we do have, at this point, you always have some source of ideology that favors violence in the world. Almost at any time in human history, you will find such a group. Right now, it's Islamic fundamentalism that is dominating that area. And these people, many of them, are not easily deterred. They believe that dying in their cause is a good way to go, and ends up well for them, both in terms of their honor and in terms of what awaits them in heaven. Finally, we are target rich. We democracies are target rich. I don't need to go into that much with you, I'm sure. We're open societies. Our infrastructure is widely exposed. We go to ball games, we go to concerts, movie theaters, people move around, train systems, and we have lots and lots of targets that are available to individuals and groups who would like to do those things. Now, these dangers are somewhat matched by the dangers of using, even declaring an intention to use preventive force. What are they? They are, to start with, the increased instability you can get by just announcing a doctrine of preventive force. Just by saying to your enemies that you are contemplating attacking them before they attack you can get their attention in a negative way. They can say to themselves, as you might well imagine, if you'd been small like I am, you would imagine this very well. Big guys say to little guys, I'm going to beat you up. I don't know when, but I'm going to beat you up. Well, there was a strategy I developed in boarding school. I went to boarding schools most of my life. That when I knew a big guy was going to attack me, I would hit him first. And that is what's going to happen with a lot of little guys in the world. If you announce that you're going to act preventively, people who really believe you, that you really are going to act preventively, are inclined to act first. There is that danger. Now, in addition, after you act, of course, there's always the danger of a response, which has its own awful consequence. What is that? That is, you don't want a response. So what do? You escalate the level of action that you engage in. And preventive actions, let's face it, most of them, not all, most of them are more prone to error than responding to an attack, an actual attack or an imminent attack, because you're making a prediction about your enemy's state of mind and what that enemy is going to do. And predictions of that sort, with that kind of empirical data, are more frequently wrong than a prediction that is really either the guy has already attacked the state, or because the attack is imminent, you can see more. There's more evidence to reassure you that you're not going to make the kind of mistake we made in Iraq. Intelligence is flawed, and so there's always the possibility of error. Finally, there are some areas where this kind of a warning is useless. It does not deter your enemies. The world out there regards preventive force as inequitable. Why? Because who talks about preventive force? The big forces, the big powers. They talk about preventive force. So they see it as a doctrine that is associated with relatively powerful states in opposition to relatively weak ones. And everywhere we engaged, the Stanford task force that led to this book, which was led by George Shultz and Coit Blacker, the task force, which went to very difficult places like Italy and Japan for conferences and met European and Asian diplomats. And I also interviewed South American diplomats and African diplomats. And one of the themes that you see from all of these discussions is using force like this, i.e. preventively, more often than not leads to more harm than good. And these are experienced people whose opinions have to be taken into account. So despite these dangers, what happens in the real world? We have 150 or more incidents since the adoption of the UN Charter where some kind of preventive action was taken that neither constituted self-defense under the Charter nor met the requirement of an approval by the Security Council. Therefore, under conventional international legal standards, was illegal under international law. Now, we were very interested in that. We looked at these incidents. We broke them down, as you can see in the book, into 9 separate categories. And they're interesting to talk about. Looking at facts is really interesting, even if you're not dealing with a science. Even in politics, facts can sometimes have a bearing upon your understanding of something. Those categories are protection of nationals, abductions, targeted killings, attacks on terrorists and terrorist infrastructure, the response to subversion of democracies, attacks on weapons of mass destruction facilities, humanitarian interventions, cyber attacks, and preventive war. So you see a broad range of these kinds of activities. And as you might imagine, the reaction of the international community to these activities will depend to an extent on the type of activity you're engaging in and on the circumstances. And by circumstances, I don't mean the relative legality or illegality. It turns out the international community looks at these things and asks itself, well, to what extent is this consistent with UN Charter values, even if it's clearly illegal? And so you look at one category like humanitarian interventions, and you see, if you look beyond Kosovo, of course we know about Kosovo, clearly illegal, and yet international lawyers are writing it's necessary and just. And we land up with something illegal, even though it's necessary and just. You know there's something wrong with your system of determining appropriate rules. Well, there have been humanitarian interventions, not perhaps intended solely for humanitarian purposes, but having that effect in many situations since the Charter was adopted. In Bangladesh, in '71, Tanzania, where Tanzania went into Uganda and got rid of Idi Amin, I would say that was a very important humanitarian achievement. Vietnam, going into Cambodia and getting getting rid of the people who massacred over 2 million of their own people. France and Central Africa, where they got rid of Bokassa. Of course, what we did after we made the terrible mistake of allowing Saddam to attack the Kurds, we went in and protected the Kurds in '91. And then the African regional organizations have engaged in 3 interventions, significant interventions, that did not qualify under strict charter rules in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Lesotho, to keep military people from taking over democratic governments. They rationalize this as follows. When this happens, it leads to a humanitarian disaster. So we are stopping a humanitarian disaster by getting rid of this tyrant. What do we do, really, when we're faced with a situation where you have a system of law that is not providing rules to deal with a serious threat to civilized societies, where societies all over the world, not just the US, are ignoring those rules and engaging in uses of force? What standards does someone who is interested in national security, the national security of his country and the national security of the world, what do you look to for guidance? And we share with the UN high-level study report that Steve Stedman here at Stanford was executive director of. We share their view that you should look to legitimacy. Now, legitimacy, you don't find that word in the Charter. And it's a vague concept. But the very vagueness of legitimacy carries with it 2 great advantages. First of all, there's a great advantage in the international community of invoking legitimacy because it signals to the international community that you're interested in their thoughts, in their position, not just yours, that you are genuinely interested and will set up a process for hearing what they think about your situation and what you may plan to do. Now, secondly, the vagueness does not necessarily mean a lack of power. People try to use legitimacy for many, many things. And you don't have to look at all the uses of legitimacy when you're using it for this purpose. There are, in fact, many standards that have been articulated by scholars and practitioners that give meaning to legitimacy and give content to it. At the same time, it is not a binding rule. It does not purport to be. And that has a great advantage because what it tells you in the NSC or wherever you plan your own nation's security, it tells you that you do not have to pay the price of surrendering your sovereignty by paying attention to the opinions of others. That's what legitimacy connotes. And that concept can have a lot of power because you go into the process voluntarily without the sense that you're going to surrender to some artificial rule that no one really in the world pays much attention to. And we looked at that legitimacy systematically, and we found seven standards actually that that go through in the book. The seriousness of the threat, which I think is very important. Necessity, which is a traditional legal standard. Proportionality, which too is a traditional legal standard, but these 2 standards have been preserved and are thought of as functional in our societies. International support, that is, what do your friends say? Not just what your enemies say. Are your friends against what you're doing? Not just your enemies? Are your enemies in favor of what you're doing, what you plan to do, or not so much against it that they're signaling a willingness to tolerate it? Proper purpose, very fundamental. Does what you're doing reflect some purpose in the UN Charter that that is accepted and widely espoused. And confidence in your findings and conclusions. This is very important. We've made mistakes, and mistakes, as I said, are inherent in this process. And finally, a great old Catholic tradition, the balance of consequences, the idea of not doing more harm than good. Come down to it, sit down, think about where you're going, and make a good faith judgment as to your confidence that this initiative will do more good than harm. Because if you can't feel confident about that, you're almost sure to be doing something that, even if it's legal, let alone illegal, and you're testing it, even if it's legal, you shouldn't be doing it, we concluded. And so that's the book. Now, what we did, we worked very hard on this. We came from a bunch of different perspectives politically. Number of us served in Republican administrations. A number of us served in Democratic administrations at very high levels. The current Deputy Secretary of State was a member of this group. The current Assistant Secretary for Policy in the State Department was a member of this group. Indeed, one of the major participants in this group's work. So we did not take on explicitly any of the specific issues that that face this country or other countries such as Iran. What we tried to do was provide a guidance to national security planners that would give them essentially, assuming they're in good faith, of course, people in bad faith, you can give them the tightest rules in the world, and they're going to ignore them. As you probably know, the Second World War, the Germans and the Italians and the Japanese, all three of them, issued declarations that they had been attacked, and they were forced to take measures, in three different places in the world, relatively simultaneously. In self-defense, which was ludicrous. But that's the kind of thing that can happen, obviously, if you're in bad faith. So we're always dealing here with the concept of people who might use this book, who are in good faith, who are really trying to avoid being arbitrary, to avoid being dumb, which is so easy in these very, very difficult matters. Thank you. Now, I'm looking forward to engaging you guys in a discussion, and I understand that the first 5 questioners will get a free book. And I was going to say, without any hesitation, that I will guarantee a free book to any of you who makes a good faith commitment to read it. Go ahead.
Sure. You're on. Yeah, they'll get your mic over there.
All right, there. Thank you for that. We recently talked with former Secretary Perry. Actually, Tommy and I are both in a class where he spoke yesterday. And he was mentioning the role of nuclear nonproliferation and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty on sort of preventing these things from happening in the first place. I mean, some of the scenarios that you mentioned dealt with, unconventional warfare and everything of that sort. How do we balance that type of diplomacy, trying to get people to give up their nuclear weapons voluntarily, like we did in Ukraine and former Soviet states, but at the same time apply a credible threat to their facilities of weapons of mass destruction if they refuse to give up their nuclear weapons?
That's very difficult. Secretary Perry wrote a very important study on preventive diplomacy. And there have been many studies of preventive diplomacy that have been undertaken, but his is excellent. We focused on the force part of it because people are not comfortable talking about force. And there have been lots of willingness to talk about, oh, how we can avoid this, and we can, if we work hard enough on preventive diplomacy, we can avoid it. Of course, the book unanimously, the entire task force agrees that that's the way to go first, to try preventive diplomacy. But as you can see from the collection of the incidents, it doesn't always work. And as Secretary Shultz repeatedly says in his speeches and really in his book about how he operated in the Reagan administration as Secretary of State, the possibility of using force, the fact that the people you're trying to convince to give up a nuclear ambition, the possibility, the fact that the possibility of force is there has a positive impact on their willingness to take into account the disadvantages of their acquiring a weapon of mass destruction. If you don't have a credible force dimension to your diplomacy, as I think we today do not have, you will find that people will ignore you. I mean, when it came to North Korea, we had the Clinton administration and the Bush administration, two administrations that went to North Korea repeatedly. There are actual quotes that you can find where the presidents, both presidents, said, under no circumstances will North Korea be allowed to have a weapon, a nuclear device. And we allowed it to happen. The Iranian government, if you and I were sitting in the NSC in Iran and we had that history in front of us, it's meaningful. It says that the U.S. Can threaten and not mean it. And of course, I didn't favor and do not favor attacking North Korea. I would never have threatened North Korea with an attack, because attacking North Korea would release at least 5,000 artillery pieces that the North Koreans have lined up ready to destroy Seoul. And the estimates are, 1 million dead from such a response. And I don't know how you devise a system for attacking North Korea that would do more good than harm. So I wouldn't threaten where I can't follow through. What you need to do is find objectives that are perhaps less grandiose, to send the message that at some point that's really credible, you intend to do something. Now, with Iran, we don't have the problem that we have with South Korea and the vulnerability of South Korea to a North Korean attack. On the other hand, we have a country that has never attacked. This particular regime, even, the Islamic regime, has never directly attacked another country. They were attacked by Iraq in the Iraqi war. And I don't know if you read Scott Sagan's article about what he believes to be unlikelihood of Iran ever attacking with a nuclear device. But there are also others who are very much against the current regime, who aren't at all expecting Iran to use their nuclear weapon. Of course, it could have grave consequences even if they don't use it. But once again, if you build an anti-ballistic missile system around Iran as your measure, as the measure that you're going to rely on to protect Iran's neighbors, and if you can't even credibly launch a economic boycott of Iran, and you're not really doing anything else, and the only thing you're talking about is an actual invasion of Iran to destroy all these nuclear facilities, which now are scattered all over the place, you have a policy that is on its face not credible. And this is a serious problem that would lead to your enemy doing exactly what you don't want the enemy to do. Indeed, being encouraged to do it in the sense that you domestically make it very difficult for them when your whole focus is give in, stop this program, and their whole policy in terms of their nation and their getting elected is, no, we won't give in, and I'm going to get elected because I'm standing up to you, the big bully from the West. I mean, I don't know if you followed this, but you recall what Ahmadinejad agreed to ship his low enriched uranium for enrichment to a higher level for medical purposes. And that was a big breakthrough, and the administration was very happy about that. Why didn't he do it? Because when he went home, the, quote, liberal Iranian who had run against him, I've forgotten his name, what? Yeah, Mousavi, right. Went public with a vicious attack on his capitulation to the United States and the West, but for agreeing to this, giving up this wonderful and important national program. So here you go. Everyone's got something bad to say about Ahmadinejad, but that's what he has to face domestically, is the situation where he goes back there, anything he agrees to pursuant to our demands is going to be questioned and criticized even by those people who we feel closer to because they're more in favor of human rights, etc. So it's a very difficult thing. When you need a credible diplomatic process, and for that you need a credible element of force. Yeah. I promise to make my answer shorter.
Thank you for coming to speak with us. So I have a question about national sovereignty, and I had been under the impression that like the right to protect and the what's called the Bush doctrine of preventive war like represented like sort of profound new approaches to the issue of national sovereignty. But it seems like from what you said, there are sort of these several precedents of either preventive war or humanitarian war. And I'm just wondering do you think in fact that these preventive war and the right to protect, do they represent these new things that are going to have profound effects in terms of legal precedent going forward, or do you think these are just sort of events in a long line of the same occurrences?
I think that they are profoundly important. International law has not moved. Basically, international lawyers seized upon what their reading of the Charter to limit the use of force. They thought they were doing God's work by doing that. Of course, the Charter, the language of the Charter, doesn't support these absolute limitations. Article 2.4 doesn't say you may never use force unless it's in self-defense or with Security Council approval. It says that you should not use force in a manner inconsistent with the purposes of the Charter or with the sovereignty of the particular states involved. That's what it says. Now, if you want to talk about an action, a use of force consistent with the purposes of the Charter, humanitarian intervention to avoid, let us say, a genocide, is clearly one such purpose. And I think by trying to artificially create a world in which everybody is constrained from using force, even for the purposes of advancing the Charter, you are going to end up ultimately you're going to end up with a whole slew of exceptions, exemptions, and disregard. Especially because, as you were suggesting, sovereignty is being undermined from within, in a sense. There are so many sovereign nations that are failing to perform their duties. The Security Council passes resolutions articulating these duties. For example, the duty not to permit terrorists to operate on within your country and to attack other states. There are so many countries that are allowing these things to happen. The duty not to inflict grave humanitarian violations on your own citizens. That what's happening is the world is reacting to them ad hoc. And the total picture that is emerging from all these ad hoc actions is that in certain categories of conduct, with the understanding that the use of force is tailored to the legitimate purpose that you've identified, then practice is developing along the lines that are very familiar to us. And that is, what do we expect at home? We expect the law to protect people. That's what we expect. Now, that's a revolutionary concept, that we really are looking to a world. Ultimately, it's going to happen slowly, but if we're going in the right way, it is going to happen. And that is, these thugs that run several countries in the world to this day are ultimately going to be viewed as thugs, not as sovereigns. And that the world community is just not acting in a manner consistent with the notion that no matter who is sovereign, that sovereign is equal to everyone else and is entitled to all the protections of any other sovereign. It just isn't so.
Good afternoon. I have a question about terrorism specifically, and you mentioned briefly the use of preventive force in the form of positive military action to deter terrorists. Can you talk more about a more passive form of deterrence, maybe something like traditional deterrence theory that could be used or adapted to deal with terrorists today?
Well, I think the most important passive form of deterrence that I've seen studied carefully is, in fact, another study by Perry, where he talks about preparation for attacks. Now, I do not believe only in preparing for attacks, but I think preparation for attacks sends a very good message to the enemy that you are not going to fold, that you're going to minimize your damages, you're going to minimize the injury done to yourself, and particularly with terrorism, if you really prepared for attacks of any type of weapons of mass destruction, what you'll end up doing, and Sagan is excellent on this. He's pointed this out in his writings. You end up having a really good health system. You build the capacity to immediately respond to a biological threat, a chemical threat, and you do the kind of thing that President Obama, to his credit, is doing right now, trying to clean up the available enriched uranium and other fissile material in the world. Now, you could snort at that. You could say, well, this stuff has been going on. There have been already 20 transfers of this kind in the last 20 years. Hooray is what I say. I mean, every transfer of this kind of material to our custody or to the custody of the Russians, where it would be broken down or used in some other constructive way, does enhance security in the world. And these are the kind of passive measures that I think have a very positive effect. I'm not going into the kumbaya world.
I was wondering that, especially now in the post-Iraq world, how the U.S. might help to reestablish legitimacy of the use of preventive force now that our reputation has been damaged? Is there any way that we can maybe, in the future, if we have to use it, take a position which seems to be more legitimate or people accept as more legitimate?
That's a very tough question, because I think there are many people who will never accept the action in Iraq as legitimate. Part of that is there are many within that group who regard it as illegitimate, not our intervention, but our taking sovereign control of Iraq, which was a terrible mistake because it signaled to the world that we were actually trying to act like a sovereign in another sovereign state. And the French, the Indians were appalled at that. And so we can't correct that now. We've already reversed that decision. What we can do now, I think, to shore up our credibility is to end the Iraq intervention in a successful manner. There's nothing that would harm our posture and our influence more than, in my view, than failure. And I think the president has certainly redefined what success in Iraq means, but not to an extent that has created a situation that could be described as phony. He has stayed in Iraq. The U.S. is shifting gradually security control to Iraqi forces. And if the American people are led to understand, and the people of the world are led to understand that perhaps our ambitions were extravagant at the start, but that we have learned that we don't want to pay such a huge price for our self-defense, that we really can't afford such a huge price for our self-defense, but we want to leave a stable situation that will turn into Iraq. It will not turn into a piece of the United States. And I think that over time, my experience with diplomacy, which was, at a good level, and at 5 years with a very, very capable bosses, namely Shultz and Baker. Over time, foreign states that are important to us will respect stability and steadfastness more than almost anything. And so even if you make a mistake, don't compound it by making an even bigger mistake. And so credibility depends upon our leaving, having shown the world that we really did care about stability, and that we haven't stolen all of Iraq's oil, and that we truly have improved the situation for women. These are things that over time we will benefit from greatly, I believe.
Yeah, my question deals with you tend to sound that international law is something that we really need to try to follow as best we can, but clearly our enemy right now being being the kind of fundamentalist Islamic terrorists, they have no regard for that. So aren't we putting ourselves at a disadvantage by trying to adhere so closely to international law when our enemies are not doing as such? For example, should the police in the United States, or at least SWAT teams, be allowed to have weapons that, say, wouldn't be legal for an ordinary citizen to have, but if the gangs and criminals are going to have these high-powered weapons, would we be doing our disservice, by having the police with just regular handguns instead of arming them with sufficient tools to combat the criminals? And so I guess in our case, the military and intelligence with enough capability to fight the terrorists with better weapons and better tactics and better intelligence gathering methods.
Well, I don't know how you got that impression, because the book concludes that international law doesn't work related to the use of force, and that we've had to rely instead on legitimacy. Now, there are certain aspects of international law specifically the rules relating to necessity and proportionality, and the concept that you don't deliberately attack non-combatants. Those are rules that I think any civilized society would adhere to. Now, how you interpret them is of course a matter of some dispute. No, I think I agree with you entirely with what you said. We do have to arm our troops with things like drones that are capable of going to places that we can't send our soldiers, to kill our enemies in as discriminate a manner as possible. And we do have to convince the people of the world that the concept of reciprocity has not disappeared from the face of the earth, despite the efforts of international lawyers to discount it. When a state traditionally utilized a method of attack, such as the Japanese and the Germans in the Second World War, where citizens, non-combatants, were deliberately killed in bombing raids and other things. The response of the Western forces was deliberate attacks on citizen targets, And now, a lot of international lawyers are arguing that would be illegal after the Geneva Conventions. Well, I don't think so. I think if a group deliberately attacks civilians and then hides within a civilian group, they lose some of the right to the protection from the normal rules. And I think that concept is part of what the Charter calls the inherent right of self-defense. Why do they use the word inherent, the people who wrote the Charter? Because there are some things that are part of our human experience over thousands of years, not just 20 years, 30 years. And one of those things is you can't expect someone in his right mind to agree to die at your behest. You know, if someone figures out a way to attack you and your family, he should not expect that you will not respond to him in a way that's effective. Now, obviously, we all want to accept a world, we want to see a world where you choose effective to be the most discriminating manner possible and consistent with the notion of proportionality. But I don't agree at all with international lawyers who continue to attempt to sell this notion that there is a right, essentially, in combatants who don't wear uniforms, hide in places that otherwise would not be subject to attack, and use civilians as shields. That there's nothing that can be done about that. I just don't agree with it.
We'll take one final quick question
Good.
from Facebook online here, actually. In regards to Israel, what are the possible consequences if they enter into a shooting war with Iran over their nuclear facilities? And would Syria get involved? And what do you think the legal precedences, how will those be affected in turn?
I think that would depend a lot upon what military actions were taken. Israel has cause to attack Iran. Iran has openly supported Hezbollah, and that is a violation of the UN Security Council resolutions. They have openly supported Hamas. That is a violation of UN Security Council resolutions. Now, those resolutions do not provide for the use of force by a state that's affected, but they certainly give Israel legitimacy. And attacks an attack that was aimed at that conduct, which is relatively limited, for example, on supply depots or on ships that are being loaded or trucks that are being loaded with such weapons, could send a very constructive message to Iran that Israel does ultimately intend to use force to prevent Iran from developing a weapon of mass destruction. An attack today on the 14 or 20, whatever it is at this point, nuclear facilities in Iran would likely get a very adverse reaction from everyone, not just Iran, but from the world in general. It would be a very broad-scale attack. It would be very difficult, much more difficult to pursue, and the consequences would be much more akin to beginning a war, because you have so many targets. Some of them are close to civilian centers, others are not. So the answer is, if you're thinking carefully about an attack using force preventively, you should be thinking about what it is that gives you the legitimacy to use force. And I don't see how you would claim legitimacy to use force on a weapon system that doesn't exist. Iran is very far still from having a nuclear device. Of course, they seem to be determined to get it, but they have not enriched uranium beyond the low level required for fuel. And I just think that it would be much more reasonably viewed and accepted if Israel were to focus on more limited forms of attack to deal with the more limited types of offenses that Iran is already engaged in. See, one is a real offense that's going on today, and you're not doing anything about it. And everyone is talking about what you might do about something that hasn't happened, and you're not doing something about something that has happened, and you expect them to believe that you are going to do something about something that hasn't happened. Even if you are, you're sending the wrong message.
Well, thank you again for coming.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.